Now, doubtless will have heard other artists talk about, and you will have thought yourself an awful lot about how colour changes across form, especially with reference to value and hue. Now, people talk about hue an awful lot, and I'll be talking about that a little bit too, and value too, to an extent. But it's quite rare that people spend a lot of time thinking about the chroma of the colours that they use. And I have a feeling that a lot of people don't really know how chroma changes from light to shadow across a form. Well, thus this webinar. So I'm going to take you through, I'm going to paint a few spheres for you today. I've just got to get my glasses on so I can check the chat and see what's happening there. Hi Dawn, thank you. Dawn from Sydney says, all good mate. Thanks, it's great to hear. We've got loads of people on here. Someone from Mexico. Sirat is saying it's perfect. Thank you, Sirat, that's brilliant. John Bales, good to see you. Says everything's working fine, really glad. Okay, so what I'm going to do, just let me have a quick sip of water, won't be a second, is I'm going to take you through the painting of some spheres of different local colours. Now, what I mean by the local colour is, actually, on Facebook recently, I was having a chat with David Briggs about this, of the handprint site, and he said he uses a term called object colour, which kind of makes sense. The local colour, or the object colour, is the colour that a thing is, regardless of whether it's in light or shadow. So if you mix up a colour and you paint something that colour is the local colour, regardless of light or shadow, okay? So I've got a few spheres that I'm going to paint. I'll take you really quickly through the setup that I have at the moment. I've got, behind me here, I've got shadow box. You can't quite see it because of the way that this camera is, but I'll be swapping them over in a minute and you'll see it. I've got a shadow box back here, which I'm going to place the spheres in that I'm going to paint. Over here on my easel, I've got a drawing board. I've already roughed out the backgrounds for the paintings of the spheres that I'm going to do. And I've also got my palette here. And I've got most of the colours for most of the spheres, well, actually only for 2 of them, but I'm going to do 4 spheres, so I've got the colours pre-mixed for the other ones as well, and I'll get them out as we go, starting with the first one. So you will be able to see my subject, you'll be able to see the painting, and you'll be able to see the palette as well. And I'll also be showing you some pages from the Munsell book, assuming I've got them handy. If I can remember where I put them. Yeah, I've just put a table in front of them. Some pages from the Munsell book which will show you, I'll be able to explain to you how the chroma is moving across the form from light to shadow, and what kind of a curve it makes, because it does make a kind of a curve. So actually, let's, the first thing for me to do is I'm going to paint, first sphere I'm going to paint is an orange one. Now then, let me just show you this page here from the Munsell book, try and make sure that it's got enough light on it. Now, the first sphere that I'm going to paint, the local colour, is this one here. So it's a mid to high chroma of a fairly mid-value orange, or as in Munsell terms, a yellow-red, okay? And the curve of the chroma, you can kind of plot a curve if you judge the values and the chromas of the colours as they go from light to shadow. It's going to pretty much go like this. So the shadow will be down here. The local is about here. There's something interesting going to happen here, which I'll talk about as I do it, and then we go up until the reflected light up here and the chroma drops again. So you get this kind of bow shape like this. The chroma goes up and down. The value goes from light to dark, but the chroma pulls the colours around into this kind of bow shape. You can imagine that if this is just a straight light to dark, it pulls the colours out into this kind of curve. So the first thing I'm going to do, now I've pre-mixed some colours here. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but this is what I do when I pre-mix colours. I wrap them up in little balls of little bits of squares of cling film, so they stay pretty fresh, because I mixed these ones earlier on today and I didn't want them to get too dry before I started painting with them. So I've got a bunch of colours for the different modelling factors. Now I think I've probably described, hopefully I've described well enough what the separate modelling factors are, but I'll go through that very quickly as well once I've got the paint upon the palette. This is so handy, you can just quickly make a hole in the little cling film packet and then stick it on the palette, and you've got your colours kind of ready to paint with. Now, if you've been to one of my webinars before, or if you've seen my blog much, you'll know that what I do is I pre-mix, especially for webinars or if I'm doing form painting practice like this, I pre-mix the colours that I'm going to need for the main modelling factors, and the main ones are going from light to dark. There's the reflected light, which is kind of direct light, the very lightest part of a form, where the light which is falling on it is directed almost directly back at you. It tends to be very low chroma. If the light has any kind of colour associated with it, like if it's blue daylight, that will affect the hue as well. And to an extent, the local colour of the object will affect it. Generally, it's quite direct. Reflected light is quite low chroma. Certainly, and if you're painting indoors and painting still life, obviously, as I am here. The next one is what's called the centre light, which is like the largest area of the light of a form. That moves over into the half tone as you start going into the shadow, and then the core shadow, which is the darkest part where there's the least amount of light falling on the form, the deepest shadow. And then within the core shadow will be the reflected light. So I've got here, I'll explain that a little bit more in a second once I get onto the other camera. So I've got out here on my palette, I reckon I'm only going to need 5 colours for this. I'm going to switch over to the other camera now, and I'll explain to you a little bit more. Hello, someone from Romania, Bucharest is here, wow. Helga, I'm really glad that's working better. We've got people from all over the world today, this is quite exciting. Let me just switch over to the other camera. And it's going to be easier, it's much closer to the painting surface, so it's going to be easier for me to show you what I'm doing. So here is the sphere that I'm going to paint. Let me get that Monsel chip out as well to show you what the local is. This is the local colour that I painted this sphere. Obviously it's set back a little from the light, so it looks a little darker. Here I've got my paintings ready, or I've just painted in the background and the foreground and the surrounding areas quite roughly, because we don't need to go into too much detail, because that's not really the most important or most interesting thing that we're going to be covering today. And then over here, obviously I've got my palette, and now you can see these colours. So I've got, this is the highlight, reflected light is fairly low chroma. This is the local colour here. This is the colour of the centre light. Now this is it's the half tone, but it's also the reflected light, because they looked about the same. So somewhere between the local colour here and the half tone, I'll be mixing as we go from light to shade. And this is roughly the colour of the core shadow. So if I've judged these correctly, once I start painting this sphere, I'll rough it in first and tell you, I'll describe the modelling factors as we go. And then we'll see how it comes out. So the first thing, usually I will start with an idea of the division between the light and the dark, because it's really important to be able to keep that clear. So I'm picking up just a little bit of the of what will be the halftone and the reflected light. And it's about here is where we really, where I would say that what they call the terminator of the shadow is, where we move properly from light into shadow. So the area of the halftone is going to be all kind of around here. And then within the light part, so this is the light side, right? So you basically divide things into light and shadow. Within the light part, we'll have the reflected light, which on this sphere is about there. I'm just going to kind of rough that in very lightly. And then the local, let me show you quickly, actually. I've skipped a little bit there, because let me show you quickly how I judge these colours to make sure that they're right. What I've got here, what I'm holding up, is just a piece of grey paper with a hole cut in the middle. And this is one of the chips from that Munsell page. This is actually the local. So if I'm careful with this and I position it, this is really difficult for me to do because I've got to do it in reverse as I'm looking at the screen. You can see that there are some parts of this sphere which will be almost an exact match for this local colour, which makes sense. And then over here we go into the shadow, it gets darker and changes. So it's, but hopefully you can see how close these colours are, all of those ones that you could see through that little hole there, to all of the colours on this page from the Munsell book. And in fact, they're all pretty much here on this page. Now the crucial thing, if you're going to try something like this, and you can do it without a Munsell book as well, you can actually do it just with using just a piece of card and put your paint mixes on here to check them. The really interesting thing about this is that the hue doesn't change very much, but the chroma and the value do change. The crucial thing, if you're trying this though, is that you need to hold this color checker at the same angle to the light as your painting surface. So you can judge these colors, like if I'm judging a color for the shadow there, you know, half tone into shadow, you have to kind of choose an average, and then I mix that color and I transfer it here. If this is pointed away from the light, or if it's pointed towards the light, it really changes what you perceive. So you've got to be really careful, especially if you're holding up your mixes like this, to judge them, to make sure that you hold this up at the same angle to the light as your painting surface. Okay, that's really crucial. So there is a part of the sphere which corresponds roughly to the local. I'm going to try very hard not to get my head in front of the camera here. It's so easy to do. And it's actually, interestingly, this whole area here is the center light, but there's a bit around here which is I'm judging like this. Looks, it's a little bit too far back. It's deeper into shadow than I want to. I'm going to bring it forward slightly. That's better. There is an area kind of just around here that pretty much corresponds to the local. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this as I'm judging this, but kind of surrounding that highlight is an area, I guess we can't really get close enough for you to see, so you just have to take my word for it. And also, we have to deal with the camera as well. We have to take into account that this is on a camera. But there's an area of colour which is slightly lighter value than the local. And it's this colour here. And it's not only lighter value, it's also higher chroma than the local colour of the sphere. Which is why I've got two colours here, really, kind of for the centre light. Around that is a colour that is very close to the local. Certainly I would say probably matches the local colour. I'm just going to kind of put these in fairly, well, in fact, very blocky, because what I want to try and show here is the modelling factors and how you can use them in painting. The tricky bit here is that you have to find an average, and obviously with something like a sphere, the light is changing gradually, the colour changes gradually across its surface, which makes it more difficult to judge. So you can kind of mix between these colours. And it takes a lot of fiddling. I would say if I was doing one of these and I was trying really hard, I would probably take about an hour or more on it. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing anything like that because we'll see how we go, but I want to see if I can get through 4 today. So at this point, I'm starting to let the light drop off. So the Cromer is going down and the value is going down. This colour here is lower Cromer. And I'll show you, once we've got these main colours blocked in, I'll show you exactly where the chromers of all these colours are, and I'll show you the curve. Now, around this edge is an area of slightly lower Cromer. So I'm putting in what is the local colour here. So in fact, really, I've got 2 separate colours for the centre light, and one of them is higher Cromer than the local. And this is it's really important, and it's crucial to get right. For a long time, I actually didn't think that happened, and I thought that the lightest that a form could get was the colour of the local. But when you think about it, it makes sense, because I'm holding my local chip up at the same angle to the light as my painting surface. But some of that sphere is pointing more towards the light, it's facing more towards the light, which of course means there's more light on it, which means higher value, and it also means higher Cromer. And we'll find out where that will get us into trouble, what that makes very difficult as I move through these spheres and go on to some other ones. So this is the core shadow now, the darkest part of the shadow. What I would generally do with these is pretty much paint it in. Obviously there's some blending going on here too, but I'm trying to keep that to a minimum at this point. And then I've got the reflected light, and it's this area of slightly lighter colour within the core shadow. And the reason that's there is because there's light coming down. I've got a couple of strong bulbs in a softbox up here. The light is coming down, and it's hitting the front here. It's hitting the ground in front of the sphere, and some of that light is bouncing back into the shadow here. Another thing I should make clear is that it's one of the tricky things about doing this, unfortunately, with a camera, is that you can't see the sphere from exactly the same angle as I see it. Otherwise the camera would have to be in front of my eye, and I wouldn't be able to see anything to paint. But hopefully you can, so that the shape of the shadow may not look quite right to you, but hopefully the values overall should look pretty good. And a good check for this is if you blur your eyes, throw them a little bit out of focus. Even though I've painted this very simply up to this point, the colours will kind of merge in your eye, and it'll give you a good idea, looking from one to the other, of how close they are. And yes, we do have this problem of the camera, in that cameras do change values and they change colours. But at the same time, they ought to do it fairly evenly from the subject across to the painting. So if it's making the orange of the sphere look more orangey red, more red, it should do the same to mine too. I'm just going to do a few adjustments now. So hopefully you can see how I basically very quickly built up a reasonably convincing feeling of form and light just with having 5 colours mixed. And then mixing between them. And all of those colours came from that one page on the Munsell book. So when people tell you, if you ever see this on art forums, someone is saying, well, the best way to paint shadows is to use the complement of the light. Well, I can tell you that if I painted this shadow blue, it really would not work. It would look rubbish. But then what we're painting here, what we're after here is an impression of realism, of real three-dimensional form. I'm just going to go a little bit darker here because this is in the cast shadow. This is where you have the occlusion shadow, which is an area of no light at all. And I'm probably going to fiddle a little bit with the cast shadow because I think the shape isn't working too well. The danger for me with these things is that once I start painting them, I kind of get into painting them and I forget you know, that I'm demonstrating something and I've got a few more spheres I still need to paint. I think we're probably, the value down here is a little lower too. Hopefully you get the point. I could spend an awful lot longer on this. But let me show you something very quickly, which is the point of what I want to talk about today, is what we've got here on our Munsell page. The local colour is here, which I painted somewhere around here, okay? This area of the sphere where it's pointing more towards the light, I've gone up to this colour here. Now, that's a step up, almost up to this one. It's a step up in value because it is lighter because there's more light, but it's also a step up in Cromer, which is really interesting. Now, the very lightest part here is this colour here, right? So already we've got this kind of, this curve here, and then the half tone here is this colour because the Cromer is starting to drop off a bit. The reflected light is down here, and then the shadow is here. So what we actually have, hopefully not getting paint all over the back of my Munsell page. What we actually have is a shape that's something like this. Now this is in a little bit more detail than I showed it in the blog post that I put up last week, if you saw that. So up here is the reflected light, this bit. Transfer this curve in your mind to this page here. The local is here. There's a part here where it's higher chroma and it's higher value, and then it goes down to the reflected light and the core shadow, pretty much in a straight curve like that. So for this sphere, that's pretty much the shape of the curve. Now, obviously what I would do if I was going to be spending, from this point, I know that I've got my colours reasonably close. Excuse me. I've just had my dinner. It's quite late here in the UK. It's like 9:30. The kids are in bed. and I'm digesting the lentil curry I had for dinner. I would spend a lot of time from this point onwards adjusting all across the areas of the sphere until I really started to bring it out. And in my experience, it takes me, I don't know how long it would take you, perhaps less long than it takes me. It takes me about an hour before I get a sphere to a point where I'm thinking, yeah, that's actually starting to pop. And it's starting to look like, it's starting to fool my eye into believing that there's a real form there. But even just doing them very quickly like this, you can start to get a pretty believable description of the form. Now I'm just going to have a little look at the chat to see what anybody is saying here. Helga says, we take your word for it, Paul. Looking at colour for real is slightly different than seeing it on your monitor. Yeah, I think probably it looks like, looking at on here, I would say it looks like the Cromer is too high of the core shadow. And it does look a bit high. Which I can bring down fairly easily. What I'm doing here is I'm taking burnt sienna up to the right value with white. It's roughly the right hue, which would give me a slightly lower chroma. I think also the paint there is a bit more translucent. It's not quite opaque enough. And I would probably need to be bringing the chroma down a little bit there. Kind of adjustments that I would make by eye as I went along. And I'm going to bring out this, because it's quite a matte sphere. I'm going to bring out the reflected light a little more. I think that's a little closer. But I think my core shadow is still a little bit too high chroma, so let's try just dropping the chroma a little bit. Now what I'm doing now is I'm getting a bit of burnt umber, and I'm bringing it up to the right value, up to the same value of the core shadow with white, and that gives me a much lower chroma version of the same colour. The hue is pretty much the same, the value is the same, but the chroma is lower. And I think that's probably looking a little closer. I think probably the same for my reflected light is a little bit too high chroma. And that would make sense actually thinking about it, because the light that's reflected there is coming off a grey surface. So it ought to, if grey light hits something, you would expect it to reduce the chroma slightly. Probably getting a little bit closer to the colours there by dropping the chroma slightly. And I think the reflected light has come up in value too much, so I'll bring some of the core shadow colour into there to take that down. And this is kind of an interesting point really, because the checking has got me very close. It's got me kind of, I was going to say in the right ballpark, but it's kind of, it gets you much closer than that. It gets you really, really close. And then you need to be doing the rest of it really by eye and making adjustments as and when you feel you need them. I'm not going to spend much longer on this one because I want to move on to the next one. Hopefully you can see there how I actually had to pull the chroma down a little bit in the core shadow and the reflected light, because it was looking a little high. Some of that may be, this is going to sound like the world's worst excuse, but some of that may be down to the camera. I don't know. I would expect the camera to affect both fairly evenly. Let me have another quick look at the chat. Someone says, does the local colour is near the terminator? Yes, it is. Kind of near, but between the local colour, the area, the patch of local colour, and the terminator is you're going into the half tone. So the local colour I've put about here. This is the local here. So it's about there, and then over here it's going into the half tone. And then for the half tone, this is the terminator here. So the half tone is here. And the local colour is about here. So really, the local colour, it belongs to the light. It's a part of the light. I'll probably spend a little bit longer on this one than I will on the others. But we're getting pretty close, and I think with some adjustment we'd be able to get there right on. Tammy has asked, will this be recorded? You can't stay the entire time. Tammy, yes it will. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to the replay, and it'll be up on YouTube. So don't worry, it'll be there for as long as you want to see it. Okay, so that's our first one. So hopefully that's been clear. It would really help me if you can tell me quickly in the chat if it makes sense to you what I've described there. These colours that I have, I call this I call it a modelling string. Sorry, something is bugging me about this painting of this sphere. I've got a really hard edge down here where I really don't want one, and it's really annoying me. So I'm going to have to do something about it. I don't like hard edges in shadows. They spoil the form. Yeah, so, sorry, I was saying, across here I've got modelling colours. Modelling string. From the very lightest, the reflected light here, which is fairly low chroma, which is about here, or lower chroma, than the local colour, which is here. And then we go over here into the lightest part of the sphere. It kind of comes out a little bit here. Higher chroma here. In Munsell terms, the local of chroma of this sphere is a 10. That's a 10 there. And sorry, I think I haven't quite got all of that on the screen. So this is a 10. In Munsell terms, this is from the big glossy book, and it goes up in steps of 2. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, incredibly high chroma. Orange doesn't get that high in paint. Some colours do, but not this. Not orange, not yellow, red. So the local is there, so it kind of comes around here into this slightly lighter part, which is facing more towards the light, down to the local. And I'd painted it down here with the reflected light here and the core shadow here, but then I had to knock them back. So it's probably a steeper curve there. So you've kind of got it's coming from the shadow up like that to the local, and then there's kind of a bulge, if you like, at the top of Cromer, where it's facing the light. And you'll find that on pretty much any form, I think. Cash says it makes sense. Thank you, that's great. Oh, Kate says the curvy low at the top of your board didn't show on the camera. Oh, didn't it? Oh no, it didn't. Thank you for letting me know. I'd have happily gone steaming along. The problem is that the computer is behind me, you see. So I can't actually see the screen as I'm painting. I should really try and sort this out a different way. Let me jiggle things around a bit and I'll show you that curve again. Okay, I'm going to paint it on here. Try and make it a bit clearer. So if I plot those colours on that page, the light, the centre light here is about here, and then it goes right round into this kind of slightly, I'm hoping this is on there. Yeah, this is on there, this kind of bell shape here. So the local colour is here. The light is here. Remember, we've got light to dark and then low chroma grey to high chroma. So there's this bell kind of shape here where the chroma is higher than the local. Then it comes down to the local at about here. Obviously this depends on lighting conditions. The point of doing these under controlled conditions is what you learn about colour in the process. And then down to through the half tone. The core shadow is down here. Actually, we'll do that a bit steeper. The core shadow is down here and the reflected light was about here. So you end up with a curve something like that shape, which if you translated it onto the Munsell page would be going around like that. Okay. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm going to swap over to another sphere in a second, but just let me... So I'm just switching over to the main camera so I can talk to you a little bit now. So Cash says it makes perfect sense, and I'm really glad that it does, Cash. I try to explain these things as clearly as I can, but I'm not always sure that it's very difficult when you've been working with something for a long time to kind of get the concept across. Helga thinks it's probably getting there now and looking better. And Jim says, how would the chroma curve for the orange ball change if you were using a warm light versus a cool light source? Well, it's a really good question. I've no doubt that it would change. These are color corrected bulbs. So they're, I forget the actual temperature of them, but they're, as near as makes no matter to the colour of daylight, fairly neutral. If you use a coloured light, then that will really change what you see. It will really change the colours that you perceive. And they will vary depending on the local colour of the object. So if you might have seen this kind of weird effect you get when you see street lights, very orange street lights, and some colours look literally grey under an orange street light, because they seem to cancel each other out, like blues, they will cancel each other out. So what I'm talking about here is, this is a very controlled kind of a setup I've got here. And the point of doing it this way is that you learn general kind of laws of colour, if you like, in very controlled conditions like this. So then you can start to make sense of other conditions. Obviously it makes it much easier to paint still life, which is what I mostly do. But you can also start to understand, hopefully, better what's happening in other lighting conditions. Like if you take this outside on a sunny day, obviously it will be very different. At some point I'll start talking about that too. But I'm trying to get these concepts across now with very controlled kind of still life interior painting. Cash says he's been struggling with colour through the highlight on an African American male portrait. This helps so much. Cash, I'm glad you said that, because I've got something coming for you very shortly. Actually, shall I go? Now we'll do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to steam through a couple more spheres pretty quickly. The next one I'm going to do is just to show you that this works on different colours as well. I mean, each one that I've got has a different reason for being there. The next one I'm going to do is this one, green, okay? It's an interesting colour to do because, I mean, so much of the natural world is green. I'm going to end up getting paint on my fingers here, but because I only painted this sphere yesterday and it's still a little bit wet. These spheres, by the way, are just made out of styrofoam, and you can prime them with acrylic primer and then just paint them with oil paint, and then you know exactly what colour you've painted it. Let me swap over to the camera on the painting surface again now. Bring the easel back over. Up here, obviously, I've got the same thing, pretty much the same thing. The hue is slightly different than the sphere, but that shouldn't matter. As long as these kind of rules of painting, if you like, hold true, it really shouldn't matter if the hue is slightly out. It should still look like a convincing sphere. It would just look like a slightly different hue. And the reason I think it's a slightly different hue is because I mixed this green. Now, the green, the local colour of this sphere is, I believe it was this one, value 6, Chroma 8, yeah. But this is the hue has turned out to be a slightly more blue-green, and I think the reason for that is as the paint has dried, it's probably got a bit more translucent, and this sphere used to be blue. Underneath it's blue, and I think that's kind of why. But it shouldn't make an awful lot of difference, right? Because I've gone through the orange one in some detail, so let's bang through this one pretty quickly. It's the same shape, so the divider from light to shadow is going to be in pretty much the same place, about here. My reflected light up here is slightly lower chroma. It's incidentally the local of this sphere is the same value and chroma of the one above, just a different hue. Now this is the brightest area of the light. I'm not even going to do really any judging on this. Let's just kind of throw these colours in and then see what we've got. Here's the local. So in the light area, I've got one part of it, this is the center light. I've got one part of it which is higher chroma and higher value than the local, and the majority of it around that is pretty much the local color. And again, all of these colors are the same hue. I suspect slightly more yellow-green than the sphere, or a slightly blue sphere. So my core shadow, better change brushes. Is just down here. Oh no, this is one of the problems that you find with greens, yellow greens, and actually with blue greens too. When you get down in the lower values, it's very difficult to cover cleanly in one go because the paint is semi-transparent and it won't cover all that well. What do you think? If you see what you can see on the monitor, is the actual sphere a slightly more blue-green? than the one I'm painting. Here's my reflected light. I'm being rather less careful about this one. Pretty much banging it in. This is the local. I'm painting back into the reflected light, so I'll end up with something between them. I guess some of the mixing I would do actually on the thing itself, and the half tone, dividing the light and the shadow. To me, this is the bit where when you put the half tone in, you start to create the form. If I'm painting low value green things, like, yeah, it's definitely more yellow, I think. More yellow green. If I'm painting low value green stuff, like if you're painting flowers, the leaves and the stems, I give them two coats. I'll put down like I think the correct technical term is an ébauche. First, which is just kind of scrubbed in colour, and then cover it properly on the second go. So let's have a look at that. I think we're somewhere near, but I'm not too convinced by the shadow at the moment. I think that helped a bit. Gradually getting closer. I've got something in between. I'm mixing between the half-tone colour and the local. To make that transition a little bit more subtle. I'm not really going to go any further with this one because I really just wanted to show you how the same thing happens. Hopefully I've taken this one far enough, because I want to get onto Cash's comment a minute ago about painting African American skin, and I'm actually very well placed to help with that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. This is going to make you laugh. Okay, so hopefully that's enough. I haven't really blended it, and I would spend ordinarily a lot more time trying to make sure that each of those colours were right. But we're pretty close, and that one only took, a matter of minutes because I wasn't spending too much. Someone says in the chat that it is green, but the variation isn't strongly evident. It's not, to be honest, I think it probably is more obvious to me sitting here than it is on the camera, but I think you can probably still see that it's not, it's a very slightly different hue, but nonetheless, hopefully you would agree that very, very quickly, without much messing about, I've got the beginnings of a three-dimensional form there, and the colours I've used there, this is the local. For the other one of the centre light, we went up to here. For the lightest part, here is here. This is this colour here. This is the local here, and then down into the half tone and the shadow. Again, I think I might have judged when I judged these colours and mixed them earlier on. I might have judged the shadow colours slightly high in Cromer, but not too far off. And now I'm going to show you something that you can't paint. Now, I say that kind of loosely and slightly as a joke, because I think this will interest you though. Let me just quickly go back onto the main camera for a second. I want to show you something here. Now here is a yellow sphere, okay? And it's something that you hear an awful lot. I see on forums and on people talking on Facebook about stuff. Struggling with, especially the shadow. Oh, this one really isn't right, but especially struggling with the shadow colours of very bright yellow objects, you know, like, say this. You know, they're almost the same colour. This is a slightly more orange yellow, and this is a slightly more greenish yellow, but they're almost the same. And in fact, they're almost the same shape. So it follows that if you can paint this, you can paint this, okay? Now the problem with this is I've painted this sphere the highest chroma yellow that it's possible for me to get in paint. And if you think back to the chroma the Chroma Curve that we described with the colours on both of those last two spheres, it follows that I'm going to need to go higher than the chroma of the local. Well, I can't, because I've already painted this. The local colour is the highest chroma I can possibly go, which is why those other two spheres were painted just a bit lower than the highest I could go. And I'm going to have a go at painting this, and you can see, you know, how you think it comes out. But I have a feeling that it will strike you when I actually start to put the colours down that I need more than I can get. I'm going to try. This is getting a bit tricky because I've got green paint on my hand now, and now I'm holding something yellow that's still wet, so I'm trying really hard not to get yellow paint on it. Note to self, paint the spheres earlier next time so they're dry. Right, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? So, okay. Here is the quickest way for you to find out really what colour shadows are on a lemon. Paint a cube, okay? Get yourself a cube, and you've got, depending on how you do the light, you've got your light, your half tone is usually the top plane, and you've got your shadow there. And you can use one of those little colour checkers to make sure that you completely nail that, because it's flat, it's a flat surface, so it's pretty easy to see the colour, you know. If you can paint a cube, and if you can model form, I just lost one, then you can paint a sphere. And if you can paint a sphere with accurate colour, you can paint a lemon, except for the difficult thing that I'm about to show you about the chroma. Okay, so I've got my colours for this one pre-mixed as well. I'm just going to stick them out on the palette quickly. This is my reflected light. Now here is my local. And as I was saying, ideally I would have another colour which is both higher value and higher chroma than that one, but I can't, because I've already gone as high as I can possibly go in chroma terms with paint, with my local. I can't go any higher, which effectively means I can't paint the colours that I'm perceiving. Reflected light now. And core shadow. So let's get through this one fairly quickly. Running out of medium now. It'd be alright though. So first I'm going to follow the same process as I did with the others. First let's pop in the shadow, the division of the shadow and the light. It's going to be roughly the same. The very lightest part of the sphere, the reflected light, slightly lower chroma and high value. Now ordinarily what I would be wanting to paint next is an area of higher chroma than the local around this, but I can't do it because I've already gone, this is the local colour of the sphere. And there are two effects of that really. One is that I can't get my yellow intense enough at the right value to accurately describe the lights. And it also means that I have less available to me. I have less colours available to me to model the form here. So it's probably going to end up looking a little bit flat compared to the others. So I've got to paint the whole of the centre light with the local, because that is the highest chroma and at this value that I can do. I mean, it's not bad, it's light, you know, I mean, we're talking about quite small differences here, but I can't get that little bulge into the Chroma Curve. So this is my half tone. This ought to be fairly accurate because it's dropping in chroma and it's dropping in value to within the range of paint now. So that ought to be pretty good. My core shadow. Reflected light. I'll bring the local back a little into the reflected light, with the modelling a little. Fairly quick and dirty, but most of the colours are right. It doesn't shout at you as being wrong, but if I could have just got a slightly higher chroma into this yellow at a slightly higher value, I could have brought out this area of form around here much more. The shadow side is looking pretty convincing. But in the light side, I'm not even sure the camera can translate this. But over here, I can see higher value and higher chroma that I can get here. And I've done this so many times, and I've sat and I've tried to figure out what the problem is, and I've wondered why it is that I just can't seem to get, you know, quite often lemon paintings, they look slightly dull. And part of the reason is that people get the shadow colour wrong a lot of the time. But also it's because, excuse me if I just knock the mic, is that once you get up to the very lightest parts, the centre light, you can't quite get, if it's a very bright lemon, you can't quite hit the chroma because it will go higher than what you can reach with paint. Really frustrating. So what do you do? Well, I think probably not many people know that that happens for a start. But secondly, you can kind of adjust by eye, which I suspect is what most artists do when they paint all the time. I think this way of doing things and this way of practicing and learning about colour is incredibly valuable, because it means that you don't have to spend anything like as much time in frustration tearing your hair out at the easel trying to figure out why you can't get the colours that you can see, because you know why, and you can start to adjust. So in the same way that you can compress value, I have a feeling that you could compress chroma too. And of course, buy darker lemons, as someone has just said in the chat. The other one is to put them further back in the shadow box so they're slightly in shadow. So you can adjust that way, you know. Someone has said, Sharon has said, if you're not using the complementary colour for the shadow, what do you mix with it? Grey, brown. It depends on, it depends entirely on the local colour. And that's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked that, because you can't just pick up, sorry, I just need to have a quick sip of water. You can't just pick up one colour or two colours and have it get you all the way through. Now hopefully what you can see just at the very bottom of my palette here is a bunch of different colours. Okay, so let's take this green string. Up at the top here I used, what is that green? It's a lake colour from Michael Harding. Let me dig it out of my box so I can remember what it's called. It's a high chroma green, and it is bright green lake. The only way you'll get a green that high chroma is to buy a tube pigment that will take you that high. So at the top here I was mixing this with cadmium yellow because I needed to swing the hue further over towards yellow, and with white to bring the value up, and that's how I got there. Around here I think I used the same pigments, the same tube colours to mix this colour here. This green brought up to the right value with white, and then a yellow, cadmium yellow. Here I used this green, but I also needed to pull it round towards yellow, but I didn't want to bring the chroma up too high, and I didn't want to bring the value up, so I used sap green, and I mixed sap green up to the right value with yellow, cadmium yellow and white, and then I mixed it with this, and that's how I got both of these colours here. Down the bottom this is almost entirely sap green. The shadow colour for the green one was sap green with, what did I mix that with? A little bit of burnt umber to swing it round towards yellow, and I think a little bit of cadmium yellow to bring up the value and try and keep the chroma fairly high. So I've used different pigments right the way through the range, you know. I'll talk about the flesh one in the same terms in a minute. This orange one, up here I was using permanent orange with cadmium yellow and white. Same here. Around here I started mixing in burnt sienna, which is about the right hue and reasonably high chroma at its value. The value of burnt sienna is actually below the lowest value here. So this was, down the bottom here, was burnt sienna brought up to the right value with, I think it was with white or possibly with the orange. And I also mixed in some quinacridone rose, which is it's a kind of a blue-red, like alizarin, brought up to the right value with white, because I had to pull the hue over towards red because it was going too far towards a yellow-orange. So I've used different pigments throughout the range there as well. And here too, at the top I've used cadmium yellow and lemon yellow plus white. For the local colour, cadmium yellow and lemon yellow plus white. The reason I've used both of those yellows is because the cadmium yellow was too orange, so I had to pull it round towards green, towards a more green yellow. The only way I could do that was with lemon yellow, and that also dropped the chroma slightly too, which is why I couldn't get that high chroma at that hue, at that value. Couldn't be done. Around here I started to mix in yellow ochre and sap green, both brought to the right value, and then with cadmium yellow. And on down here, I think by the time I got to the shadow colour here, I was using sap green with burnt umber. Both of them mixed to the right value with yellow, and then mixed between them to get it right. So this one too, as I moved into the shadows, I went into burnt umber and sap green. But here's the point about this, and I'll go on to the main camera for a second. I think it's really worth pointing out here. The beauty of this method in using Munsell is that it doesn't matter what tube pigments you use. What matters is the colours that you can make with them. If you look at flesh tones, there are any number of ways that you can mix a flesh tone. Some of these colours, there are different tube paints I could have used to arrive at the same colour. What matters is that I get these colours right, is that the values are right and the chromers are right, and that the hue is right, that I keep the hue fairly constant across the form. And Munsell allows me to do that. Tube paints will not allow you to do that. If I tried to mix any of these with just a couple of different pigments, just a couple of different tube paints, it would have looked wrong. You know, I have to be able to try to push the chroma as much as I can as I go into the lower values for a higher chroma object, and I have to keep the hue right. I have to keep the hue steady. And in order to do that, I need to use different pigments. And if anything, that's one of the most important things for you to get from this whole exercise, from this webinar, is that as chroma changes across the form from light to shadow, you have to change tube pigments 9 times out of 10. Tube paints to different ones in order to get the colours that you need. There is no one colour that you can choose for any local really, which is going to take you all the way through from the light to the dark. The solution for the highlight is use white. Again, it depends on the hue. Often, yes. If your local colour is white, quite often you can mix white in, but it might not be. You might need to be mixing other colours in. The lighter parts, now none of the highlights here are actually white, as you can see. This one, again, was cadmium yellow and lemon yellow and white. It wasn't just white, although I could probably have just put white into the local and got fairly close. I still needed, once I'd put the white in, I still needed to adjust the hue a little bit more. I think I had to put a bit more lemon yellow in. The proportions weren't quite the same, even though the pigments were the same. So you can't just expect to bang white in and it will work. Now again, a lot of artists will not use this exact method for judging colour, and you don't, you know, when you're just painting, you might not always want to. But doing these kind of exercises shows you how colour works across a form, so that you're not guessing anymore. And if you do want to make changes to something, if you do want to change the colour, you're less likely to produce something horrendous because you've got more idea of how colour works. All right, so this is for Cash. In fact, well, of course it's for all of you. But Cash brought up something about this earlier on, and I've got one more sphere I want to paint. Thank you for staying with me this long. I know we've been going for quite a long time. Have a look at these two spheres. Now, both of them, I'll get them over into the light a bit better. Both of them are painted, they're painted different locals, but both of the locals, again, come from this page. This one, Milk Chocolate Malteser, is this colour here. It's the Cromer is 6, and sorry, the Cromer is 6, and the value is 6, and the Cromer is 4. It's 5YR64. This one is here. The value is 4. The Cromer is the same, and the hue is the same. So the only thing that's different between these two is the value. They're the same chroma and they're the same hue. Now this is me. This is a pretty close match for the skin colour of the back of my arm. This is my wife, and she is she's English, she's British, but her family is Jamaican. You would say she's black, right? You would say I'm white. This is a really good match for her. Surprisingly close. Even when I showed them to her earlier on today, she was like, oh, you know, that's not me. And we checked and we had a look. And it's right, they're really close. Now, a lot of the times people will say, if I'm trying to paint a black person and to get their skin right, you know, firstly, I've got to say this, please stay away from the blue. It's just, it's not a colour that's there. I don't know why people do it, and I've seen it so many times, and it's a little bit worrying. It really makes me wonder. Now, the colour of the highlights, to explain this for you, we're on 5YR, right? And here is, hopefully you can see this clearly enough. Let me just check. Here is our 5YR. Is it? Oh no, it's 5.4. 5.4, sorry, not, or is it 4.4? 5.4. 5YR 5.4. So your highlight is going to be, assuming neutral light, okay. Obviously, if your light has some color, that will change it. Your highlight is going to be up here. It's going to be lower chroma. It's going to be higher value, but it will be the same hue, pretty much, assuming neutral light. So that's what you need to mix. If you want to mix a highlight for African American skin or black skin, whatever you want to call it. I mean, this is plainly not black. It's going to be about up here. Now, for white skin, Caucasian skin is here. The highlight is going to be somewhere up here. So the curve is basically the same. They're just in different places on this page. So for this one, which is, I'm doing this one because I've got the paints mixed ready for this one. I planned to do both, but time ran away from me this afternoon whilst I was getting all my paint pre-mixed. And this one I'm going to do really quick. You can see I've got my colours mixed up here. So I'm going straight in on the half tone, and I'll put in roughly the division between the light and the dark. You know, one of the questions you see most often asked, it seems the thing that foxes people more, the colours that fox people more than anything else, are the colours of skin. And, you know, I've seen some wild theories on forums about what colours you should use to make skin right. You know, you've got to do a green underpainting and then paint over it with pink, or, you know, stuff like this. And really, it's, if you want to find out, I think this is slightly too red and too high chroma, but let's keep going anyway. It's probably closer to the colour of my hand, actually, because I'm kind of reddish. Especially at the moment, because I'm on steroids and for some reason they make my skin go red. Again, first centre light colour is higher value and higher chroma. Here comes the local. Five YR 6.4. I'm going to mix between them a little bit for this part of the sphere where it starts to turn away from the light again. And when you think about a form, you know, you think about its angle to the light and how that is likely to affect the colour. It's, you know, a lot of it becomes fairly obvious about what's actually happening. I'm going to do this one really, really quickly. Core shadow. I can see already before I put that on that's too high chroma, so I'm going to drop the chroma a little bit before I do. I'm going burnt sienna to the right value with white. It actually is pretty much the same. It's the same chroma. I have to drop it a bit more. What value have we got there? This is probably, this is a neutral. Drop the value a bit with the neutral. Sorry, not the value, the chroma. Have I dropped it too far, or is it all right? You could tell me what you think. Does the chroma look about right compared to what you're seeing on the core shadow or not? Reflected light. And I've dropped the chroma even further here because, again, this is a half-tone colour here. Again, it's reflected grey light. Drop the chroma slightly. Half-tone goes in. Destroyed the form somewhat with awful drawing. I'm rushing a little bit with this one. And I'm not being very careful about the painting, but because I nattered a little bit too long about the colour. But there you go. You can see, hopefully, that with some refinement, no changes in colour, but some refinement of the form, this would eventually get to be a pretty convincing sphere. And actually, if you can paint a sphere of this colour believably, then you can paint the range of most human skin. And if you are struggling with the colours of a model, find out the local colour, mix it, match it against the back of their arm or whatever part of them it is that you're trying to paint. Take that colour and paint a cube with it, and then paint a sphere with it, and do paintings of those, and figure out what those colours are. And I think you'll find that you won't be struggling with what colour to paint the skin of anyone, no matter where they come from in the world, because the variation, the difference between our different skin colours is actually is really, really small. Skin tones. Now, Helga says, skin tones, I struggle with the warm and cool. Oh, I've got a few comments. Hang on, let me try and catch up with these. I mean, I'm done painting now, and I've showed you what I wanted to show you. So if you've got any questions about any of this now, this is the time to pop them into the chat, because I'll have a quick look through, and I'll answer anything that comes up now. Okay, so let me just catch up to the right bit. Okay, I'm nearly there. Buy darker lemons. Thanks, Cash. You know, Cash, somehow I knew that was you. And Cash, you didn't hijack the demo. I was planning to talk about skin colours anyway, and to show how using a method like this you can break anything down to be much simpler and much easier to paint and to figure out the colours. Now, someone has said here, would you use that page for skin tones, the 5YR page? Yes, I would. The variation is very small in terms of hue. It will go a little bit, that's an orange, right? We're all orange. It might go a little bit towards a yellow-orange on some people, a little bit more towards a red-orange on others. I'm personally a bit more towards a red-orange most of the time. I suspect that probably some of that is genetics, but the difference between us, especially genetically speaking, is so minor as to be almost non-existent, really. And this shows you what the scientists have been telling us for years, is that we're much more alike than we are different. So yes, you can find almost every fleshed skin colour that you need from that page, or from the 2 pages either side of it in the big Munsell book, and the range is very small, you know. So you could take those colours and pull them slightly towards yellow or slightly towards red, and you would be able to nail any skin colour. Now, Helga has said, with skin tones I struggle with the warm and cool tones. My advice to you would be, forget about warm and cool, and think about hue. Think about getting the hue right, and think about getting the chroma especially right as well. And then warm and cool, frankly, will take care of itself. I've put up a couple of blog posts about this before. If you just eyeball a model and you're just looking at somebody, it's going to be pretty difficult to get those skin tones right. There's no reason why you can't use an isolator like that on any form, including a person. A person is just a form with a local color in light and shadow, just like a sphere. You can approach them exactly the same way. So if you're struggling with a color, like I was saying before, match the local. Find out what the hue is. I mean, obviously, if you've got Munsell, this is 100 times easier. If you've got the Munsell book, if you haven't, you can still do it by using an isolator and just making sure that you stay in the same hue area. And don't fall for any wild ideas about how hue changes over form, because it does change a bit, but it doesn't really change all that much. Diana said sap green is a compound color. Can I replace it with a single pigment color? Karma brand paint. There is a sap green. Does it bother if it is not the Windsor brand? Well, you know, it's all. I mean, paint is it's just paint. I mean, I use the best paint I can get hold of. Usually, I use Michael Harding. Sometimes I use Winsor & Newton for some colors. Because you can actually get higher chroma in them than you can in some Michael Harding paint. Not very many. Winsor & Newton sap green is entirely different than Michael Harding sap green, which is much lower chroma, surprisingly, and much lower value and less and more towards blue. Winsor & Newton sap green is higher chroma, higher value, and more towards yellow green. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that you can reach the gamut of colours, the parts of the colour space that you need to reach for what you're painting with the colours that you have. Now, I'm not talking obviously about paint handling characteristics or transparency and opacity and that kind of thing. For me, I paint opaquely anyway. I don't paint with transparency, so I'm afraid you're on your own with that one. And people say, I'm not convinced about the single pigment thing either. Now that bright green that I showed you earlier on from Michael Harding is a laked pigment. It's got a couple of different pigments in it anyway, and they're laked, which is I don't understand enough of the science to be able to explain to you exactly what's going on. But it's because the pigments come from dyes and they don't carry properly in the vehicle, so they bind them, the particles of pigment through a chemical process which they call laking. So suffice to say that paint's been messed about with quite a bit, but I'm not going to decide not to use it because of that, because it's got the chroma that I need, about the right value for me to be able to hit an area of the colour space that I can't get any other way. So I'm going to use that paint. I don't really mind if it's single pigment or not. What I care about is whether I can hit the colours that I need with it or not. It does bother me that sap green is transparent now. If anyone out there ever finds an opaque sap green, let me know and I'll love you forever. I was just holding forth about sap green, and someone said in a comment here that sap green is very universal. Well, try Michael Harding's against Winsor & Newton. They're entirely different, seriously. I don't know about other ones. I've only got those two. Yeah, pull out your 5YR page. Study those skin tones. Cash, I'm hoping that is you saying that. Yeah, you totally need to get your 5YR page out. It's in the great thing about 5YR is it's in the student book, so you don't even need the big Munsell book for that, you know. Excellent. Jim has said, is that a homemade palette? Not really. Now this palette comes from a plein air setup, but you can get these from prolificpainter.com. And I like this so much, I've just started using it as my everyday palette. Usually it has two wings that fold out on either side, which are also incredibly handy, but so they fold over, you know. I've taken them off just for this. Usually I have them on and I have stuff stacked up on them. I've taken them off just for this. Prolificpainter.com, really brilliant. I mean, it's a bit expensive before you're buying as a palette. Obviously, I'm planning to do some plein air at some point as well. And it comes with a contraption for setting up your palettes and your painting surface and stuff like that. Could you talk a little about, someone has said here, Giles from New Zealand. You're very welcome, firstly. And could you talk a little about the cooling effect of white in highlights and optical greys? The cooling effect of white in highlight, again, I wouldn't call it cooling. I would call it a drop in chroma. And if it's titanium white, it could also be a shift in hue towards blue, but I suspect what you mean is a drop in chroma. So if I mix, this is why, again, why I don't like the terms warm and cool, although I know everybody uses them an awful lot. If I mix titanium white into an orange, you would say it cools the color, right? But what it's doing is it's dropping the chroma. But if I put a blue against that orange, then the blue is obviously cooler too. But neither of those things tell you anything about those colors, just saying, yeah, this is cooler than orange. All right, you know, subjectively it is cooler than orange, but what is the hue, what's the value, and what is the chroma? And if you can tell me those three things, I know exactly what color you're talking about. So it's mostly probably on colors on the orange and yellow side, and red side of the hue wheel, that area of the color space. If you mix white in, especially if it's titanium white, which is slightly bluish anyway, what you're seeing mostly is a drop in chroma accompanied by a slight change in hue. That's what people would call the cooling effect, but you can get that effect different ways, you know, and people would call different effects cooling. That's why I don't like that term. Now, optical greys. Now, I think what you mean here is when you mix complements together to get something near a neutral. You can get some really nice colours that way, but you can get them any other way as well. Because I mostly use Monsell, for greys, I use the term neutral, and I will paint with neutrals, like the backgrounds for all of these studies were painted with neutrals, and they were mixed with burnt umber, ivory black and titanium white. So it's not the kind of bluish grey that you get if you just mix ivory black and titanium white. It's moved slightly around, basically drops all of the colour information, and you just have value. I don't personally use complements at all, although I did recently try an experiment painting with a very limited primary palette, and I had to try and find some low chroma browns, and I couldn't do it, you know. And also, it's because I was trying to mix these colours, the only way I could bring down the value of something was with complement mixing, and I had to try it. And I've got to tell you, compared to the way that I mix, obviously I haven't talked much about the mixing method in this webinar because I was particularly talking about Cromer, but a method called bracketing, I'll put some links in the email for the when I send out for the webinar replay. It's just a much more efficient method of mixing. So changes would be more about subsurface stuff like blood, bone and hair. Cash, yeah, I suppose a lot of it would be that. I believe that your hands are more red because the blood is closer to the skin. I believe that my head is more red than the rest of me, and because of the drugs that I take for my illness. So yeah, stuff like that. I suppose it's blood closer to the surface. Yeah. And regarding the sap greens, Grumbacher, Winsor Newton and Gamblin. I haven't tried either of those two, only Winsor and Newton. So yeah, Michael Harding. And another one that I've just come across, Cranfield. Apparently, funnily enough, started making handmade paint before Michael Harding, and I'm next door to him. And I recently got hold of their ivory black, and it goes lower in value than Michael Harding ivory black. Oh, not very much, just a little bit, but you know, it all counts. So that's good news. Right, let me just have a quick look. I'm going to wrap up now, but I'm going to have a quick look about just to make sure that I made all the points that I want to make. The main thing is I want you to understand is that chroma changes across the form and how it changes. The second thing that I really want you to get from this is that you can't use the same pigments all the way through from light to shadow on a form. You need to switch to get the colours that you need at the right hue, at the right chroma for the right part of the form. And for lower chroma, middle and lower chroma objects, there's often a lot of choices about what you actually use. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with the replay. It's going to end up on YouTube. Oh, someone's just asked me quickly, what medium do I use? At the moment, I'm using Gamblin Neo Megilp. I don't use very much of it, just a little bit. To be honest, I just use it to work into the brush before I start, really, so I'm not painting with a dry brush, and even then sometimes I forget and I don't really notice the difference, so I could probably stop using it. But it's quite a nice medium. Thanks very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. As I say, I'll be emailing you very shortly with a link to the replay. And now that I'm safely installed in my new studio and I have so much more room for my lights and cameras and stuff, then I'll be doing a few more of these, and I'll see you all again very soon. Goodbye.